Hi, Josh.
Hello, Brink. How are you? It's been a while.
I'm good. Yes, nice to talk to you again.
Very good to talk to you.
And I'll see you when they post this.
Yes, right. Yes, it would be good to see you if we could see each other.
One of these days we'll actually meet face to face.
That would be a nice thing. I'd like that.
So we're going to lead off today with the big Supreme Court ruling last week, the Boumediene decision on habeas corpus. You've read the decision. I've read a fair amount about it. Why don't you set up for the viewers the result and the opinions and the conflicts and so forth?
Well, in brief, the decision, concerns the detainees in Guantanamo, and the court majority, 5-4 opinion with Justice Kennedy writing for the majority, says that those Guantanamo detainees do have habeas corpus protections under the Constitution, that they can, they have the right to petition to be brought before a judge to see whether or not they're being properly held. This is the culmination of a series of decisions. The Bush administration is 0 for 3, a series of decisions in which the court has rejected the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo, and there were a number of issues that were tricky in the decision, because these are detainees who are being held not on
non-citizens, not in the United States.
Non-citizens,
right?
Not in the United States, exactly. And the precedents in this area were, were uncertain. But in the end, the decision rejected the idea that it matters that these guys are being held offshore, though the United States officially doesn't have formal sovereignty in Guantanamo. The court decided, and I know it seemed kind of right to me, that this is a territory, a place that's completely under the control of the United States, and a bunch of prisoners who are completely under the control of the United States. And the fact that they're being held in a place that, legally speaking, is not subject to American sovereignty shouldn't really matter. I don't know about you. It seemed to me to be, the right decision to make. I should say, I say that though. I'm not sure how much good is going to result from the decision. These guys were being held in Guantanamo essentially because the Bush administration was looking for a place to keep a bunch of people where they thought they could keep them outside the American court system. But, there were lots of other places to keep people, and lots of people who are being kept in other places. So.
Right, and maybe even places harder to find out about.
Places that are harder to find out about, and places where people are even more subject to abuse. Nevertheless, the principle seemed to me to be right. And there were a few things that I was struck by in reading there were two dissenting opinions, one written by Justice Roberts and one characteristically semi-hysterical, one written by Justice Scalia. And
that's the one where he said that this decision is going to kill Americans.
Yes, there would be more Americans who would probably die as a result of this decision. And the thing about that remark is, if a state passed a law that said that girls could drive at 18, but boys couldn't drive until they were 25, the court would overturn that law. And I don't think Scalia, and it's probably true that more people would die as a result of the law being overturned.
Right.
But I don't think that I somehow am not imagining that concern would be expressed by Justice Scalia in that case. And it's a concern also in the people raised in the case of abortion. Women will die as a result of restrictive abortion laws, and it just seemed like what's now become a characteristic form of hysteria on Scalia's part.
Yeah, and there's stuff on the other side of the ledger, right? The kind of crazed power grabs of the Bush administration post 9/11 have, I think, probably been an effective recruiting tool for terrorists.
Yes, well, there's actually there's a story that appears. This is a Tom Lasseter story, McClatchy Newspapers, Washington Bureau, and this is about Guantanamo detentions and the number of people who were detained there, mistakenly detained there. And part of the argument in the article, you can find it online, is not only is there were people mistakenly detained, many people mistakenly detained there, but that the mistaken detentions and abuse of prisoners there have served as recruiting devices for Al-Qaeda. So, I think on this issue, this seemed like overreaching. I also thought, though, that there was very little attention. I'm not sure that I saw any attention in the dissenting opinions to the fact that to this concern about mistaken imprisonment. There are lots of people who've been held erroneously. And the thing about that is that it's hardly a shock. I mean, this is why you have habeas corpus protections, is because you're worried about executives detaining people without any good reason,
and hiding their mistakes.
They make mistakes because they're trying to keep bad guys off the streets, and one way to keep bad guys off the streets is to keep lots of people off the streets, and so the idea that there's a problem of erroneous detention, of excessive detention in a program like this is not surprising at all, and I didn't see any.
Right, and it's something that conservative defenders of the Bush administration's theories of power just never even begin to let enter their minds.
Yeah, I mean, it's
everybody there is just assumed to be Osama's henchman.
Right, even though many of the there's not been there's really been no there were no grounds for making that judgment,
Right.
And this was McCain said the other day this is one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court, and look, there's some serious competition there. Dred Scott and Plessy v. Ferguson, and I don't know, maybe you and I divide after that point about
I can chuck in some New Deal era decisions that I would put in there, but Korematsu, there's lots of
Korematsu was pretty bad, and I'm not a big fan of the Lochner decision, but anyway, we're not going to get into. We'll just stay on common ground. So there's some serious competition, but the thing that McCain didn't express any concern about it, and here, very much in the spirit of the comments and the dissenting opinions, was that there were a bunch of people there where there was no good reason for thinking that they had done anything that deserved their detention. There's also a related issue, which was particularly important in Souter's concurrence, where he drew attention to the fact that you've got people who've been held there for 4 to 6 years. And this is part of the concern that I think he has, is, and it goes to this issue about, is this a war on terror, or is this, should we think of this on the police model? You got a bunch of people who've been detained who are not caught, so to speak, in uniform, because this isn't a conventional conflict. It's also, a war that has no obvious point of termination. So if you said, let's hold these guys until the war on terror is over,
right.
they're looking forward to a lifetime in prison. So I think those aspects of the conflict were a large concern for Souter, but I didn't see them as a concern for in the dissent.
Now, I would say, from my perspective, it's not an obviously rightly decided case, but it is a rightly decided case. And let me just say that Cato, or my Cato colleague Tim Lynch, filed an amicus brief in this case against the government on the winning side, and I consider myself a moderate civil libertarian. I take civil liberties seriously, but I'm not. There are people who can outflank me in their solicitude for civil liberties, and I would say that my solicitude for civil liberties is more attenuated when it's foreigners being held off of American soil and in a quasi-war situation. Nonetheless, I think, for me, if you think about this less as a case of the rights of the detainees, and more of a case of the subjection of the executive power to some kind of independent check, so less of a civil liberties issue and more of a separation of powers issue, that really brings it into focus to me. That here's at the outset, I would have completely sympathized with this. Well, we were making things up as we were going along. We were completely uncharted waters, and it did feel like a war, and there was a state sponsor, the Taliban regime, at the outset, and worries about other state sponsors that haven't panned out as much as I might have believed back then. Anyway, but what we have is something that is called a war that occupies the entire planet's surface, including here, and goes on forever. And so under that cover, for the executive power to be able to just proclaim people bad guys and throw them in a hole for the rest of their lives without any check by anybody else, just doesn't feel like part of our constitutional system. And so that leads me to think this was the right call, especially after such a long passage of time when there's been no efforts to really process these people in a workable way, and so they've been in there a long time, and it's time for some kind of showing that there's a reason for their detention. And I would say that the conservative reaction to the decision, both on the court itself, in the dissents, and in the larger commentariat, has really only strengthened my sense that this was the right call.
How so?
It's just as you said, the sort of quasi-hysterical reaction without any recognition of trade-offs on the other side, without any recognition of serious separation of powers problems, without any recognition of the deeply problematic nature of calling this a war if it goes on everywhere forever. It's just just total uncritical rah-rahism for the sort of maximalism on executive power, and that just stinks. And that doesn't have much to do with the real libertarian strains that have existed in the past within the conservative movement. They seem to have been completely fleshed out. So,
there is something. I guess this is something I agree with you about that. I mean, I have a little bit of just 2 points here. One is I have a little bit of trouble drawing a sharp separation between the separation of powers issues and the liberty issues, because
right, of course, the separation of powers is a bulwark of liberty.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that it's easy to focus on the separation of powers issue because there is some unclarity about exactly the extent to which constitutional rights, belong to people who are, not citizens, and although the constitutional rights are said to belong to persons.
Right, there's a jurisdiction issue that looks tough if you're focusing on the detainees, but if you're focusing on the Bush administration, they're here. They're right in D.C. It's unproblematic that the court has jurisdiction.
Yes, and that's true. But I also think that I think that the jurisdictional issue in Guantanamo is you're
right.
But I have a tough time. That seems like legal formalism. That word.
Right. To me, it doesn't matter where they are. The fact that they are in this sort of peculiarly American foreign place is just an accident that makes it a little bit easier. But I don't care where they were. I just don't see how the executive power gets to make this call without anybody objective looking over the shoulder.
And this is so that brings me to the second point, which is there was when Justice Alito was being considered for the court, the criticism that was made about him was that he had never met a decision by an authority that he didn't like, and it was really by any authority, whether it was by the executive or by authorities in prisons or in companies or whatever. He was the guy who likes decisions by authorities. And I guess the thing that seems, what I'm hearing you say, and I certainly am very sympathetic with this, is a real point of common ground between us, is that there is something disturbingly authoritarian about the tone of particularly the Scalia dissent. Roberts has some complicated points in his thing about whether or not the existing system of protections sufficed, and whether you really had to go to full habeas corpus protection. And, issues there get complicated and maybe subtle. A majority seem to me to have a better case there, but I can understand that. But there is a kind of a tendency to deference to authority, powerful tendency to deference to authority in the administration and on a substantial part of the court that is disturbing. And this I think leads us to to broaden out the conversation beyond this particular decision to. McCain said, I hate the decision, one of the worst in history. Obama says, I like the decision. That tells us something about the kinds of people they're going to be appointing to the court. What's your... Before we get into the broader McCain-Obama issue, what's your view about...
the Supreme Court stakes of this election are considerable, and they're considerably more vexing for me than they have been in the past. Let me just back up and say one thing about the kind of conservative distemper on there's the phrase reductio ad Hitlerum, that is when one side of an argument compares the other side to Hitler, they lose, because it's just such an over-the-top conversation killer, right? You're not serious about persuading anybody, you just want to call names. When you tell the other side that you're killing Americans, you're not interested in reasoning with anybody anymore, right? You just want to stigmatize them, and you just want to whoop your side into blood fever, and you're not interested in reasoning anymore. And that to me seems like a besetting problem for the right these days on war and peace issues. They've just gone over the top, and so and in particular in the area of completely unchecked, untrammeled executive branch power. And this was a 5-4 decision, and there's some of those 5 may be retiring in the next 4 years, and so
Justice
if we want
Stevens
to preserve,
is 89, 88, 89,
if we want to preserve habeas corpus and just some sort of separation of power structure in these complex of issues, then the stakes are high. And so, to me, as a libertarian, that's just a gigantic concern about a McCain presidency. Of course, he's going to face a Democratic Senate, and that will hem him in to some degree. But clearly, his preferences are to get someone as likely to vote reliably with the authorities as possible. and that to me is a big minus. I would say again, just part of my general drift away from the right over the years. It used to be that when I thought about the Supreme Court appointments, it was for me, a fairly straightforward advantage for Republicans. I'm pro-choice, but I think Roe was a pretty lousy decision, so I was never terribly upset about the idea of Roe being overturned, and had confidence that things would work out okay in the state legislatures. I know we may disagree about that, but that's the way I thought. And on civil liberties issues, as I said, I'm something of a moderate, and I had felt for a good while, that the Warren Court had gone too far, and I didn't mind some of the Rehnquist Court retrenchments. But now we're in a new ball game here in this post 9/11 environment, and of course I have a quaint belief in the actual original design of the Constitution as one of enumerated powers, and there was at least the only people talking about that kind of thing and ruling acts of Congress unconstitutional because there's no enumerated power that authorizes it to do that in the Constitution. The only people talking about that were people on the right. But now I feel like it's a mixed bag. I don't like the kind of airy-fairy. I feel I have policy preferences in a particular direction, therefore they must be in the Constitution. That I feel is an ongoing temptation of people on the left. But that's changed a lot. I think that kind of sort of spirit of the Warren Court is pretty far behind us. And so anyway, right now I think it's a complicated question, and I'm inclined to think right now from my perspective the merits favor the Democratic candidate on this ground. And this,
I'm not sure why it's. Maybe you could say. I'm not exactly sure why it would be so complicated. Maybe you could be. So let me say a word about that. I mean, I can see a case that. I can see somebody making the case that McCain might give you a kind of a suitor appointment, and then a case that he might give you the next Scalia-Alito appointment. And these are guys who are not. I think this is your point. These are guys who are not libertarians, or as I prefer to say, classical liberals. These are guys who are. Essentially, very, very deferential to authority. So he could give you one, or he could give you the other. And I think what I hear you saying is, okay, so why take the chance that you're going to get another, that you're going to replace Stevens and or Ginsburg with an Alito or a Scalia type. The thing is, they're more deferential to authority in sort of criminal justice concerns. They're less deferential to legislative authority when it comes to campaign finance regulation, which we differ substantively on that and constitutionally on that. They are less deferential to authorities that are imposing racial preferences, where we have substantive disagreements. They're less deferential to legislative authorities on term limits, where I thought that should have been constitutional. So there's a bunch of issues where conservatives vote the right way, in my view, and are more suspicious of the authorities than the left might be. So to me, it is a mixed bag. Right, but those there's the danger for you, and I think the danger for me, of a McCain presidency appointing another. Replacing a Stevens and or Ginsburg with another Scalia or Alito type or Thomas, then what you've got is basically a highly deferential to authority court for a generation. Seems like a big danger. Obama is elected, and he's going to replace Stevens and Ginsburg, who are the two oldest justices, assuming that they're the next to leave the court. I think Scalia may be third in line. But Stevens and Ginsburg he'll replace with somebody like Stevens and somebody like Ginsburg. I mean, maybe it'll be Cass Sunstein.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the conservative choice that is in the small c sense. The status quo.
That's right. You're going to get a status quo court, probably. Barring some kind of personal disaster, you could well end up with a status quo court with Kennedy remaining the swing voter on the pivot on the court for. Throughout the first term. It is also, it's a pretty pro-business court down the line. So the dangers of McCain seem very great. Now, you don't like campaign finance regulation and you don't like affirmative action. And there is, I suppose, the possibility that with two, and maybe it would require a third Obama appointment to move the court. But here's what I wanted to push back on a little bit. This is one of these cases where we have to decide what's really fundamental and what do we not like but we can live with. And I think where we're in agreement is. What's really fundamental here is that if you get another Thomas or a Scalia or an Alito who's highly deferential to executive authority, this could really be a terrible thing for the evolution of the Constitution. You may not like the phrase.
I say it's a mixed bag, but I think the equities now, from my point of view, come down in favor of Obama on this score because. This is as fundamental as you get. This is the absolute foundation of our constitutional structure: is separation of powers, and not only have the conservatives decided that in wartime the separation of powers goes out the window, but they've defined wartime to be
forever, forever and everywhere, forever and everywhere.
Yeah. So that just can't be tolerated. Yeah. So anyway,
So you think this is so put in those terms, and we'll come to the more. This is a nice segue into the more general election issue, but to put in those terms, and I'm maybe giving a little bit of spin to what you've just said, but I mean to be really restating it. You think that this is basically an election about the Constitution.
Well, it certainly is on that score, right? I don't know that. If McCain squeaks out a victory, he's going to be facing an overwhelmingly Democratic Senate. So I can't picture that he has any capacity to put an Alito or a Scalia on the court. So I'm not sure that it's just as black and white as you might want to paint it. But he's clearly he's aimed in the wrong way from my point of view, and so that's a serious knock on
right.
him.
So if we take seriously his comment that this decision last week, this pro habeas corpus decision last week, is one of the worst decisions. Not only wrong, not only a little bad, but one of the worst decisions in the history of the court, which means that he's thinking of it as being like the Dred Scott decision. So if he really thinks that, then
that is of a piece with the number one reason why, the number one thing I don't like about John McCain, which is that the centerpiece of his candidacy is about trying to trump up this sense that that the wolf is at the door, that we are under existential threat, and that the normal rules that have governed this country for 2+ centuries need to be chucked, and I don't buy that.
So it is, to that extent, there is something about it is an election that might go. We never can be sure about these things, but it might go really to the heart of the basic constitutional principles.
Well, it's going, So I'll put a link up for viewers. There was a piece in the Times of London yesterday about Republicans, independents, conservatives, libertarians who have have come out for or are leaning in favor of Obama, and I was interviewed for that and quoted in it.
And you sent me the piece, and I read the piece about a half an hour ago, and you put up the link, and I heartily recommend that everybody read it. It's a really, really, I think, an interesting piece, and maybe you could say a little bit more generally about this Obamacon phenomenon.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've seen, but another good piece is by my pal Bruce Bartlett.
I did see that.
Had a piece on in the New Republic on a similar topic, and I think there are a number of reasons why free market limited government types like me would nonetheless support Barack Obama. Number one is disenchantment with the whole war strategy, and I consider these issues about separation of powers to be subsumed in that larger issue of what to do about terrorism. I think that the whole Bush conceptualization of the challenge we're facing is grievously misguided, and that McCain is offering another term of it, and so that's my number one reason for leaning towards Obama. Otherwise,
number one reason. Let me just so Iraq war / war on terror, the two. Together.
Yeah, Iraq war / war on terror / executive power claims. Yeah. All of that bundled together.
And you're not moved by the thought that the war is going really well now.
No.
No. And why is that?
It's look. Yeah. I mean, the war.
Yes, the two.
Part of it is right.
Yes.
So, which war? The efforts to prevent another terrorist attack on U.S. soil have been going great,
yes.
Right? We've done immensely better than I think any of us would have thought on September 12th.
Yes.
And part of that is because we're doing things more effectively than we did before, but I think a lot of it is that our adversaries are less numerous, less formidable, less well organized, less capable than we might have feared, and we have successfully. And you have to give the administration credit. They have networked with and worked together with foreign governments around the world and have put the squeeze on their finances and have locked up a lot of people that deserve to be locked up and toppled the Taliban regime and have kept have prevented them from reasserting power, have prevented a new safe haven of that kind from recoalescing. So all that's going well, and therefore I don't feel like we're in this ticking bomb scenario where, which is the kind of 24 TV series is always the image that the extremists want to conjure up, and I don't think we're there. We have a very grave national security problem of crazy fanatics that want to kill people just for the sake of killing people. We're going to have it for a long, long time, and if it's not Islamists, it's going to be somebody else. We have this just general problem that the richer we get and the more power over nature we have, that means that greater and greater power can get into smaller and smaller groups' hands, and so that's just an ongoing challenge that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. But just going into hysterics and junking the Constitution without trying everything else first, and with so little, I think, justification under current circumstances, is just that's all terrible. And on the Iraq War, it's a mess. We're stuck there. It has not advanced American interests. It has tied America down. We're in an inconclusive battle of factions, and I don't know who the right guys are to be on whose side. And it's just so it's a quagmire and a mess. I don't have any great ideas about the best way of getting out, but that's what we ought to be thinking about and what it looks like. And there, it looks to me like there is a really sharp distinction that Obama wants to get out. He doesn't want to do it in a way that wants to do it in a careful and a judicious way, but he wants to. His goal is to get us out, whereas I think John McCain's goal is to turn Iraq into a U.S. protectorate, a la South Korea or West Germany. He wants bases there forever, and of course he wants the casualties to go down, but he's not interested in getting out of Iraq. He wants us there as a forward presence of
Yes.
U.S. Power in that region, and I think that's just clearly a bad idea.
McCain, part of what's seems to be happening is McCain has a view about Vietnam, and he's playing it out in the case of Iraq. And his view about Vietnam is, should have gone for so-called unconditional victory. So why isn't the right thing to say about Vietnam? We lost, we got out, and things have turned out pretty good for the Vietnamese. Why isn't that the right thing to say?
Yeah.
Vietnam is in the WTO now. The biggest concern in Vietnam in the past year has been that the economy has been growing too fast. I mean, they've been growing at about 8-9% a year. It's not quite China levels. This is, 90. It's a pretty big country. It's about 90 million people, and
right, but just on the other side, you get far enough away from any tragedy, things look okay, right? Europe's doing fine, despite that whole Black Death thing. But that doesn't mean the Black Death was a picnic.
Right.
And I think our exit from Vietnam, the fact that we lost, caused a whole bunch of suffering and a whole bunch of oppression and incredible poverty because of the misguided imposition of communism and just despotic control, especially with respect to ethnic Chinese minorities, the boat people. So it was a bad scene. But you're right. We got out. We lost. It stank.
Well, let me put it this way.
And there were bad consequences, but we did survive, and Vietnam did survive.
Well, more than survive. Here's my point. I guess my
right. No, they're doing
if
okay
somebody
now. Right.
said that if the United States if we withdrew all our forces in 2000 by 2010 from Iraq, and 30 years later Iraq would be doing as badly as Vietnam is doing today, an economy growing at about 8 or 9% a year. It's not exactly paradise. I'm not suggesting that I want to move there tomorrow, but country that's pretty functional, that's doing reasonably well, and pulling lots of people out of poverty.
Just to put it the other way, if we stayed there for 30 years and they were doing about as well as Vietnam is today, the apologists for the Bush administration would say, "See, I told you that was a great idea." So either way, I don't think what happens 30 years hence is going to justify anything that's happening right now. It seemed it was a war based on bad intelligence and sloppy justifications and abysmal execution, and now we're in the midst of things where we don't really even have a clear idea of who the good guys and bad guys are.
Let me push back a little bit on what you just said. I mean, I agree with it. Bad intelligence and sloppy execution, etc. But was it just that, or was there something more that concerns you about the policy, about the sensibility, than that it was the intelligence was bad and the execution was sloppy? I mean, that's a correctable flaw. It seems to me that this was, this was driven by this extraordinary hubris that's characteristic of neoconservatism, and this was the next phase in a kind of neoconservative project, and that we have paid and are going to continue to pay an extremely high price for it. And the thing that I worry about with McCain on the foreign policy side is not that just that the intelligence will be bad, and not just that the execution will be sloppy, although that may happen too, but that the same kind of hubristic sensibility is going to dominate in a McCain administration.
I'm not sure hubris is what I would say is the main problem. Yes. It's there, right? I mean, I would say there's there was a naive, that I shared in, overestimation of the possibilities of U.S. power, regardless of what the rest of the world thought, and just regardless of the facts on the ground. There was just this heady confidence that.
Help me out here a little bit with what the difference is between that.
Yeah,
and,
no, so there is that, right? It's there. That's the hubris part. But the larger thing that's going on, I think, was just ultimately a panicky overreaction to 9/11, and that's not hubris. That's fear.
Right. Yes.
That a sense that. The barbarians are at the gate, and that we're all doomed, and that unless we do something extreme, and that's the only thing that can save us. It was panic, I think, that led me to support what they were doing, so I think that's there too. Let me just get beyond the work, because there's other reasons. Other reasons to lean towards Obama, and just the basic, I would say the most basic one is just accountability, and this is something I talked about in the article in the Times, is that just bottom line, you have a fundamental belief that if democracies are going to work, if one side gets in power and makes a complete botch of everything, they ought to pay and they ought to be bounced. I believe that in 2006, and I believe it in 2008. That's a very good argument for. That there just ought not to be another Republican term in office after these 2 terms of Republican White House occupancy, and then otherwise, I think the style and symbolism issue is one that appeals to libertarians as well as liberals, but it appeals to people that have always been very uncomfortable with and hostile to the kind of victimology and identity politics that have often characterized politics in the Democratic Party and on the left. That I think an Obama presidency puts the Al Sharptons and Jesse Jacksons out of business for good, and to me that's a wholesome development. Finally, I would say that there's at least some openness on Obama's part towards more choice-based school reform ideas. He's not on board on vouchers, but he seems to be pretty pro charter schools, and I like that about him. So that's all on the plus side. On the minus side is really economic policy and tax and spending policy. On that he's far too subservient to labor union interests, in my view, with his support for card check legislation and for his support of the amendment that was kind of killed the guest worker program in the comprehensive immigration reform efforts of last year. His language that he used in that debate about raising the capital gains rate, which was basically just sort of that there's some people that just make too damn much money and it's not fair and they need to be brought down a peg. I didn't like that.
What's the matter with that?
Also, lifting the payroll tax on Social Security while not doing anything about the retirement age or doing anything about moving away from pay as you go. I think he's not confronted what I think is the right way of approaching the entitlements problem.
But what about tax increases?
There's a whole host of increases.
I mean, this has been a basic fault line in American politics for a long time. You get killed if you say that you're, for increasing taxes. And so we have this, we do have 2 issues. One is that there is a kind of fiscal disaster after the balanced budget for better or worse, by the end of the Clinton administration. You have a fiscal disaster under the Bush people, and I know this has been a concern of yours. A big concern of yours,
yes.
and of other conservatives who've been and a concern that drives them to not just to hostility to the Bush administration, but also very big concerns about a McCain presidency. But on the issue about, but then there's a second issue, which is this extraordinary increase in inequality in the country, and particularly an increase in inequality as a consequence of people who are, at the absolute top, not just the top quintile or the top 5%, and not even just the top 1%, but the people who've been really doing well are the top 0.1% and 0.01%. Fantastic increases, and And so far as unjustified by any story about their contribution to the performance of the economy, and people who are in the bottom quintile, the bottom 40%, have not been faring so well. Why not? What's the matter under that combination of circumstances of fiscal disaster and what's the matter with saying, classical liberals here support some tax increases?
I think it's virtually inevitable that we're going to have some kinds of tax increases. That's the political reality we're facing, because we've got this entitlements sort of Damocles hanging over our head, and the only way to solve it politically in this country, where not everybody agrees on taxing and spending issues, is going to be some kind of mix of spending cuts and spending restraint and tax increases. But I am very disappointed that Obama really hasn't said word one in any sort of constructive or realistic way about the need to control entitlement costs and the need for painful retrenchments in the promises we have made on a demographically unsustainable basis, especially under Medicare. As far as the justification for high incomes, I'm an egalitarian insofar as I worry about people in the bottom half of society not doing well. I'm just not an egalitarian at all about worrying about people making a lot of money. So as far as I'm concerned, their incomes are 100% justified to the extent that they were.
Well, hang on a second.
They were obtained in voluntary market transactions without force or fraud. Then, if somebody was willing to pay them, then that's okay. And that's as deep a justification as anybody needs for their income in a market economy. So I don't buy into that premise at all. And to me, the idea that you think about incomes in terms of moral desert seems to me a kind of pre-economic way of
it's
thinking.
not a matter of desert. It's a matter of fairness. The question is whether you have inequalities in incomes that are unjustified on grounds of being unfair, and that under a change in the system. I don't think there's anything
unfair about some people being filthy rich. I think there's something unfair about people who don't have realistic opportunities to thrive and flourish and develop their capabilities. Right. But I just don't, to me, the envy of the people in the 90th percentile for the people in the 99.9th percentile is just unseemly.
It's not,
I don't share
but
it.
It's not a matter of envy. You're leaping to the conclusion that it's a matter of envy. I say it's unfairness, and you say it's
aesthetic
envy.
distaste for the vulgarity.
No, it's not aesthetic distaste. It's not vulgarity. It's that you have inequalities that are unjustified.
But tell me what Look. One of the top hedge fund guys, his income last year was probably 1,000 times mine, and my income may have been 4 or 5 times some telemarketer or retail assistant manager, and yet. I just don't feel like I'm victimized in any way by the outrageous amount of money that the
don't put it in terms of victimization, because that's the wrong frame. But let me see if I can.
Well, you're saying I'm a victim of injustice, right?
Well, I don't know if you're a victim of
you're
injustice.
Saying there's something unjust. There's something unjust about this. But I don't feel any victimization, so I don't know where the injustice is.
Let me put it this way. I think what we share is. I don't care about distances between incomes in and of themselves. I don't care about about income dispersion in and of itself. So we're in the same place on that. The issue is whether or not. So I'm basically a Rawlsian about distributive justice. So I think there are 2 things that are important. One is that people who are born into different, and I'm not sure that we disagree on this. I'd like to push back on it. One is that it's important that people have equal chances to succeed in life, to make something of themselves, regardless of the social class that they're born into. And that's why I think it's very.
They're never going to have equal. They're never going to have equal chances. I think there is a social interest in their having decent chances.
Well, yeah, and there's certainly an interest in their having. It's fairness that I'd say fairness that they have decent chances, and I think if there's some concern. I think when their chances are unequal, though whether or not that can be remedied is another matter. Okay, but so we agree that that's one concern. I'd say it's a concern about fairness. If you want to put it in terms of a social interest, that's okay, but I'd say it's a concern about justice and fairness to make sure that people who are equally able and equally motivated have equal chances to succeed regardless of the social class that they're born into. And the other thing that I think is that a good test of the fairness of inequalities is whether or not the inequalities contribute to the well-being of people who are in the least advantaged group, let's say the bottom quintile. So if you could tell me, I find this implausible in the extreme, but if you could make to me a compelling case that the inequalities that now exist as a consequence of the way that we've designed the rules of taxation and the system of contracts. So you make the case to me that those are as good as it can be for people who are in the bottom quintile, and if you change those rules and you diminish inequality, people who are in the bottom quintile are going to do less well, then we're in the same place. I don't have any problem with those inequalities. I just don't think that there's a justification of that kind for them.
Yeah, let me say first on the fairness front, again, let me take me and the hedge fund guy, because we're much farther apart than me and the blue collar worker. I don't see any disadvantage that my kids face as far as making the most out of their lives vis-a-vis the kids of the hedge fund guy. I feel like that money is just all gravy. And they work really hard for it, and maybe it's the most important thing in their life, and it's not the most important thing in my life. I bailed out of a higher income career to work at a think tank because I thought it would maximize my well-being to do so. So I just have no problem from personal experience seeing that money isn't everything, and what does matter, I think I've got plenty of, and my kids have plenty of. So I don't. Between me and the people in the extreme top of the income pyramid, I just don't see any unfairness problems at all. And that's the gigantic chunk of the income gap between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. So now, as far as justifying, I agree with you on the Rawlsian front. That is that you ought to have institutions that work for everybody. But we have to look at institutions. I don't want to say that one guy's ridiculous $1 billion yearly income has to be justified in what it did for the poor.
I'm with you.
I'm with you. I want to say that a general regime that doesn't tax savings and investment and instead taxes consumption, which would be the favored tax regime I have, is good for the poor because it stimulates economic growth that ultimately lifts everyone's material welfare, and most especially people at the bottom. So I'm completely prepared to justify the kind of tax regime that would result in people making whopping sums of money on Rawlsian grounds. And so we may have an empirical disagreement about whether that's whether the way I think the world works is correct, or whether the way you think the world works is correct, but I don't think there's a philosophical problem there.
Well, as I mentioned, I've got to run. I have a meeting to get to, but I think I just want to underscore what I think is the importance of that kind of philosophical agreement. I mean, maybe it's my professional deformation because I'm a philosopher. And people who agree philosophically on some fundamentals can also disagree a lot. But I think it's very important to have some kind of common basis of argument, and to see in politics that we're not just clubbing each other to grab some more power to advance our interests, but we have legitimate, reasonable disagreements. They're hard to resolve, but they're disagreements between and among people who share some kind of common ground principle. Before our conversation started, I got out my copy of Law, Legislation, and Liberty, which I'm holding up to the camera now, Volume 2, The Mirage of Social Justice, where Hayek talks about the points of agreement that he has with Rawls. These are, very different, classical liberal and egalitarian liberal outlooks, but there is some kind of common ground. And I think the reason I mention this now and emphasize it in connection with the discussion of Obama, which is where this piece of the conversation started, is that I think that part of the reason that people like you or like David Friedman, who's Milton Friedman's son, who's also become an Obama supporter, this is also in that article that you're going to put online. I think part of the reason that people like you guys are prepared to vote for Obama, or at least think seriously about voting for Obama, is that there is a recognition that while you may disagree with Obama on policies about taxing and spending, maybe there is some deeper basis of kind of philosophical agreement, the concern about putting public policy on some footing of common reason. No faith-based public policy. Dana Perino, the press aide for Bush, said the other day that President Bush doesn't have any second thoughts, and one wonders if he's had any first ones. You can't have a second one without a first. But putting public policy on some basis of common reason, finding some basis of principles founded on ideas about fairness and justice that we can use with to make the case to one another, and that's important about conducting politics on a footing of mutual respect. That's part of where I see the promise of an Obama presidency, and I don't quite see the promise of a McCain presidency.
You must know that I agree with you 100%, and that's really the whole basis of my libertarian shtick, is that bottom line, I'd rather I feel more comfortable arguing economics and social science with people I consider fellow liberals than arguing issues of just basic worldview and values with people on the right from whom I feel estranged on those fundamental levels. So I do think I believe that many on the left do have kind of ideological and attachments that aren't necessarily susceptible to reason to specific programs that I don't like. But if we can, I think there is at least the possibility of us finding a very strong accord on important values, and then if we can all be open-minded and empirical about the means to best securing those values, then I think that's a very fruitful way forward.
Yes.
And a project that I'm very much committed to pursuing. So I don't want to keep you any further. We started with agreement. We got spirited there in disagreement, and now we're winding up all cozy and lovey-dovey again, and maybe that's a good way to stop.
All right, good to talk.
All right.
Bye now.
All right, bye-bye.